In our lesson for March the 8th, we're going to look at another of the minor prophets of the Old Testament, this one whose name is Zephaniah. And like I did on Nahum, I want to give a little personal background to set the context for the lesson. Although the name Zephaniah is a common name in the Old Testament, it appears several places other than in this particular book. Scholars believe that none of those other Zephaniahs can be identified with this particular prophet. His name means hidden or protected by God. The references in verse 4 and verse 10 and 11 suggest that he lived in the city of Jerusalem. Notice the book differs from Nahum and from all the other ones that you'll see during the quarter by identifying his heritage. He says that this is Zephaniah, son of Cushai, son of Gedaliah, son of Amariah, son of Hezekiah. So he traces his lineage back 4 generations. So why does he do that? And who is this Hezekiah that he traces his lineage back to? Well, the traditional answer is that Hezekiah was the king and that he is tracing himself back to King Hezekiah. And so what we probably have here is a man who was kind of in the royal line who now becomes a prophet of God. He prophesied during the reign of Josiah. Again, different from Nahum. Nahum didn't identify when he prophesied, but Zephaniah is during the reign of Josiah. Now, Josiah was king from 640 to 608 BC, king of Judah, which was the southern kingdom, 640 to 608 BC. So sometime in that period of time, Zephaniah gives his prophecy. But exactly when? A key date is 621. 621, they discovered a book of the law in the temple, which was actually what we would consider the Pentateuch, the early part of the Old Testament. They began to read that, and there was a religious revival in the land, 621. So some people say that Zephaniah is dealing with conditions that don't fit a time of spiritual renewal. So it must have been before 621. And that's probably a good guide to go by. So before 621, Zephaniah gives this prophecy. But specifically when? Another thing that helps us is the mood of the book implies a pending invasion by someone. And we do know that in 626 BC, the Scythian invasion came, and perhaps what he's talking about here in this book is that invasion in 626 BC. So we can pretty well pinpoint the date of the prophecy. We know the person, Zephaniah, prophesies as one of the minor prophets of Israel. Now, if you'll read the book, just read through it, you'll get depressed pretty quickly. It's kind of like a funeral dirge. In fact, it's actually written in a cadence, we might say a poetic form that was used for funeral dirges. So other than the book of Obadiah, this is probably the heaviest book of the Old Testament. One Old Testament scholar says it is the fiercest of the prophets. Now, even though it has this fierce mood, it picks up on some of the common themes of the earlier prophets. For example, for his idea of judgment, he seems to rely heavily on Amos. If you look at Amos chapter 5, verses 18 to 20, you'll get kind of a similar theme to the message of judgment that we have here in Zephaniah. He also picks up from Isaiah the idea of a remnant. Judgment will come, but not all of Israel will be destroyed. God will preserve a remnant, an idea that Isaiah talked about in chapter 10, verses 20 to 23. So some common prophetic themes that he places in this funeral dirge over Judah about 626 BC as he prophesies the word of the Lord. Now, the other theme that you'll pick up on as you go through the book is the theme of the day of the Lord. The day of the Lord. It's a common Old Testament theme. And it is used in several different ways. Sometimes the Old Testament writers use that term or that theme, the day of the Lord, to refer to a time in the past when God brought judgment on His people. Lamentations 2:2 is an example of that. Sometimes the present is spoken of as the day of the Lord. In other words, this is the day of the Lord right now. Joel 1:15 uses it in that sense. But in most cases, when they talk about the day of the Lord, they point to the future. They talk about something that will happen in the days ahead. So exactly what is the day of the Lord? Whether it's past, present, or future, what is the day of the Lord? It is a moment when God reveals His sovereign control over all things. That's a kind of a simplistic definition, but the day of the Lord is any moment in time when God reveals His sovereign control over things. Lamentations 2:2 says that happened in the past. Joel 1:15 says we're in that time right now. But most of the prophets point to the future and say that day of the Lord is coming, a moment when God will demonstrate His sovereign control over all things. And for Zephaniah, this is a day in the future to which he points. So remember that all that we're saying in this lesson now kind of fits into that theme of the day of the Lord. Chapter 1 now, verses 2 and 3. He talks about this coming judgment, this coming day of the Lord. And notice he begins by saying that this is not his prediction, but it is a prediction that comes from the Lord. He begins his book, verse 1, by saying, the word of the Lord that came to Zephaniah. So this prophecy about the future is not a human prophecy. It is a declaration of what God says, a coming day of judgment in the days ahead. And notice that he pronounces a universal and all-consuming kind of judgment, and he does that by bringing in several different metaphors. He says, verse 3, I will sweep away everything from the face of the earth. Here he pictures a flood coming and sweeping away everything that it's in its pathway. Still in verse 3, he says, I will sweep away both men and animals. I will sweep away the birds of the air. I will sweep away the fish of the sea. And then he says, the wicked will have only heaps of rubble. And the picture here is of perhaps an earthquake that shakes the earth and buildings fall and rocks come together, and it's just like this rubble. He says that's what the judgment is going to be like. And then in verse 3, he says at the end of that verse, when I cut off man from the face of the earth. And the image here is of amputating a limb from the body or cutting off something from someone else. So the picture of a flood, the picture of an earthquake, the picture of cutting off things, all of these images describe the comprehensive judgment that will be coming, Zephaniah said, in the day of the Lord. Now, this universal judgment that he predicts includes, but is not limited to, Judah. If you'll look in chapter 1, verse 4 to chapter 2, verse 3, the prophet looks inward, and he said, this judgment is going to affect us. It's going to affect Judah. In chapter 2, verse 4 to chapter 3, verse 8, he looks outward, and he says, this judgment is also going to involve the nations around us, the Philistines, Moab and Ammon, Ethiopia and Assyria. So he pronounces to begin with a coming day of judgment. Chapter 1, verses 4 through 11, he zeroes in now on the judgment against Judah. Notice again the universal scope of this particular judgment. He says in verse 4, I will stretch out my hand against Judah, against all who live in Jerusalem. So everyone is going to be included in this judgment. So what is the judgment for? What is the sin that will bring this judgment? He says in verse 4, I will cut off from this place every remnant of Baal, the names of the pagan and the idolatrous priests. So the problem is the worship of false gods, the worship of idols. And he mentions three specific groups against which this judgment will come. Verse 5, those who bow down on the roofs to worship the starry host. In other words, those who have mixed allegiances, those who are not faithful to God, but also worship the idols as well. Verse 6, he says that those who are to be judged are those who once served God, but no longer serve Him. He says in verse 6, those who turn back from following the Lord, neither seek the Lord nor inquire of Him. And then verse 6 still, he talks about those who never followed the Lord in the first place. So those who are worshiping idols, those who once were faithful, those who have never been faithful, all of them, Zephaniah says, will come under the judgment of God. Now in verse 7 now, he identifies this coming day of judgment as the day of the Lord. And he presents an interesting picture here in verse 7. He says, be silent before the sovereign Lord, for the day of the Lord is here. Notice the next phrase. He says in verse 7, the Lord has prepared a sacrifice. So what he's saying is that Judah is going to be a sacrifice. They are going to be sacrificed by God. And then he says in the end of that, he has consecrated those whom he has invited. So those whom he has invited are the other nations that will be used by God to bring judgment on Judah, and Judah in this way will be sacrificed. Verse 8, he lists further those who will come under judgment. He mentions the princes, the worshipers in the temple, those who work at the fish gate, those who weigh out the silver. All of these, he said, will be caught up in the judgment that comes in this great day of the Lord. So what is the response the prophet calls for when he pronounces this judgment on the people? We see it in chapter 2, verses 1 through 3. Because the wrath of the day of the Lord that's coming, he says, those who are true believers must seek the Lord so that he may hide them on that day. So Zephaniah, during the reign of Josiah, royalty called into service as a prophet, pronounces judgment on Judah. He says, the coming day of the Lord. This lesson, I think, will provide a good opportunity for you to share with your class or remind your class about this important Old Testament, biblical concept of the day of the Lord. And down on the bottom on your outline, I point out some ideas about the day of the Lord that Zephaniah gives us in his book. He talks about the day of the Lord being imminent. It's always just around the corner. It could come any day. It's imminent. He says that the day of the Lord is a day of terror that will bring judgment on mankind's sin, chapter 1, verse 17. He says it'll be accompanied by convulsions in nature, chapter 1, verse 15. He says it will be universal in its effect, chapter 2, verses 4 through 15. He said that surviving the day of the Lord will be a remnant of His people. These common themes that we find in the book of Zephaniah run throughout the Bible in all of the references to the day of the Lord, even in the New Testament. And so it would be good to help your class understand this basic biblical concept of the day of the Lord and use the lesson on Zephaniah to do that.